I went into this wondering how I would frame Matthew's relationship to Judaism, since I see Matthew as a Jewish author through and through. And at the same time, I'm arguing that Matthew's doing something different and in some ways something novel, drawing on Mark. And so to make a case for a Davidic Messiah who suffers rather than a Davidic Messiah who conquers, a Davidic Messiah who is killed by the Romans rather than who kills the Romans, is something that would, on the one hand, be surprising in his day. On the other hand, he's doing it in a way that is entirely comfortable within first century Judaism. He's using scripture. He's using references to scripture to show that his Messiah is the Messiah and is the Davidic Messiah. That's how you do it.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. My guest is Dr. Nathan Johnson. He's assistant professor of religion at the University of Indianapolis. He specializes in early Christian and Second Temple Jewish literature. The book that we're going to be discussing, it's his award-winning revised dissertation published in the Cambridge series as Society for Study of New Testament monograph series. The title is The Suffering Son of David in Matthew's Passion Narrative. So we're going to be getting into use of scripture, how Matthew uses David traditions, particularly in the latter part of his gospel, looking at Psalms of David, other narrative David traditions. Really exciting for me. It's an area that I've been involved in quite a bit in my own research and writing. So a lot of cross dialogue there between Matthew and Mark, which should be good fun. For those of you who are new to this channel or just listening to the podcast for the first time, if you would, please do make sure you're following us or subscribed and turn on your notifications so you can get all our new content when it comes out. And if you've been watching us or listening to us for some time and been benefiting for us, and you're wondering, hey, what's one way I can say thanks or help out? The best way to help what we're doing is to become a member of the Center for Bible Study. Your monthly donation of whatever dollar amount you choose, $1, $5, $10, whatever it is, it's tax deductible and it helps support the work that we're doing. It also gets you entrance into all of our future Center for Bible Study classes, in person, online. We do all that kind of stuff, as well as access to the archives of the classes we've taught in the past. So you get a lot of content, a lot of really high quality content for very little, and you get to support the work that we're doing, which we really appreciate. So if you would consider that, that would be awesome. With that said, let's go ahead and jump into our conversation with Dr. Johnson. Welcome back, everybody. Got Dr. Nathan Johnson here. Dr. Johnson, thanks for joining us. Thanks for being on the way.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So could you tell us, just to get started, a little bit about your background, journey into biblical studies? You can be as long or as short as you like, but I always like to hear a little bit about where our guests are coming from.
Yeah, and that is a question that one could go on for a long time about.
Indeed.
I'll keep it relatively brief here. So for me, I went into a master's program coming out of my undergrad, which was in English literature. I was at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, and I happened to do a study abroad semester in Aberdeen, Scotland. And while I was there, I was taking a Shakespeare class, a Romanticism course, and I thought, why don't I take a Hebrew course on top of everything else, since that wasn't offered at my college. So I took this Hebrew course rather innocently, as one does, and got hooked, completely hooked. So came back and basically set up a Hebrew self-study program with a prof there and revitalized our Hebrew program. Even I got to do a little teaching within that. And so I'm guessing this is not the norm, but I wanted to do a master's program basically to learn Greek since I learned Hebrew. So I was like, all right, how do I learn Greek? Well, go into a master's program, in this case at a theological seminary. So that was really the start of going into formal theological education, was a love of languages. And then in my master's program, I was working on Gospel of Matthew, happened to read a bit of Hayes. At that point, we didn't have anything like reading backwards or echoes of scripture in the Gospels. So this was echoes of scriptures in the letters of Paul. And thought that was an interesting framework at first. And the more I read it, it just was one of these aha moments. It just opened up how I interacted with the New Testament and really bridged that interest between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, got me into Second Temple literature from there. So that book was really important for my development and interest.
That's cool. Yeah. Yeah, we have similar interests. We both really love intertextuality, love the reuse of scripture, ancient exegesis, all that kind of stuff. So that's awesome. And I think in some ways that explains why our first book projects were very, very similar.
Yes.
So I'm excited to talk to you about Matthew because I spent so much time thinking about this stuff in Mark. It's kind of cool to see. So first off, the book project, it may not be evident to everybody watching us or listening why one would do a book project on Davidic themes in the passion narrative of Matthew's gospel. Popularly, we always think about Matthew as the Davidic Messiah gospel, right? It begins with a Davidic genealogy. It's all this Davidic stuff. And so I think everybody just assumes, yeah, David's throughout, and, why, like, what more could one say? It's the Davidic gospel.
Yes.
So could you kind of take us into, why the book? What's the need for looking at Davidic elements in the end of the gospel and the passion? What are you suggesting and seeing that other scholars haven't in the past?
Good. Yeah, thanks for asking. So with this project, which I should say originally began as my dissertation at Princeton Seminary, I was writing with Dale Allison, who's no stranger to Matthew studies. And so,
yeah, I mean, for those who don't know, he has, along with W.D. Davies, I think we all know it's mostly Allison, has produced the, still what is the definitive commentary on Matthew. It's in the ICC series. It's a 3-volume. I mean, it's hard to imagine that commentary being surpassed anytime soon, although, I mean, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. So with an advisor like that, if you're pitching something like, hey, I'm going to do this, it has to be different than what's out there. There's a pretty high bar to clear in a way. I should say he was also fantastic and gracious to work with. But it, again, initially doesn't seem like there's much more to say. Matthew, starts off our New Testament in canonical order. And so the New Testament starts off talking about Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David. And then, as you said, Max goes into this Davidic genealogy. Matthew uses the son of David reference more than the other gospels combined. So that shows up 10 times in Matthew. Again, that's more than Mark, Luke, and John all put together. So this is a very, very Davidic gospel. And yet, as I was working in a Matthew seminar with Allison, I noticed that people were cutting off, kind of lopping off the references to David material at the question about David's son. So this is getting into Max's area of expertise, of course, here. But in Matthew's gospel, this ends chapter 22, and Jesus asks, how can, or rather, what do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he? They say the son of David. So Matthew actually sets this up as a conversation. I often have the Markan version in my head.
Yeah, he does this in a number. He does this in a number of places too, like with the Syrophoenician woman, and other places. Yeah.
And so we have this question: if David thus calls the Messiah Lord, how can he be his son? And for centuries, interpreters have taken that as kind of a period that punctuates references to Davidic material in Matthew's gospel. So the argument is, yes, Jesus is a son of David in his birth, and he's a claimed son of David throughout his ministry. But in the end, we should see him not primarily as son of David, but rather as son of God and Lord. And so there's this real tension in scholarship that I was noticing between Jesus as son of David and then Jesus as son of God, with many scholars Jack Dean Kingsbury, prominent among them, preferring Jesus to be Son of God, what they saw as the higher title. So there's this hierarchy of Christological titles that they were sort of ranking there, and seeing Son of David as, much less, or sometimes even using it pejoratively as, in some of the earlier scholarship, German scholarship, this is his Jewish ancestry. And so you could even see anti-Judaism running through the scholarship around that background, but he sort of transcended that in a way to become Son of God for all people and universalized. So some really problematic tropes that I was noticing there that I wanted to address. So I took that as my starting point. Also, no one had written a full-scale treatment of David material in the Passion narrative. And so it felt like, despite all of this David material in Matthew, it was time. It was time to do a full-scale analysis of what's going on.
What would you say was the most comprehensive before you did it? Would it be Brown's Death of the Messiah? Obviously, it's not just Matthean material, but he seems to have picked up some of the things that you had pointed out in the book.
Yeah, certainly. So Brown goes into it, and here he's trying to think through some of the historical issues.
Right. It's more, yeah.
Yeah. And so it's less narrative critical and intertextual, and more, if this is a reference to the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, do we have to go with David Friedrich Strauss and say this is therefore myth? That this is just generated from a story as a sort of vaticinium ex eventu, and using these stories to create prophecies that Jesus can then fulfill. So he's coming at that from a historical angle. And even there, he's looking at all the Gospels and getting some of this material. He's one of the rare exceptions to get this material. The other thing I was noticing is that when you start looking at church fathers or medieval interpreters, they were very aware of much of what I argue here in the book, in terms of at least the intertextual links between Matthew and the Old Testament. They were seeing it, of course, as prophecy fulfilled. I'm analyzing it a little bit differently, but the links were there. And then it really just trailed off in scholarship, where people lost interest, or they would really elevate these titles like Son of God. The other problem I was noticing is that this tension between Son of David and Son of God. In the Hebrew Bible, David is the Son of God.
Right.
It's very explicitly said in 2 Samuel 7, and Psalm 2, and Psalm 10. We get these son references over and over in the Hebrew Bible, that the Davidic dynast, the person sitting on David's throne, is a son of God, and God is his father. And so in Matthew, you get these references all the time to God as Father from Jesus. And so rather than setting those titles in tension, Son of God and Son of David, they're very complementary. And so that really, rather than having a wall at the question about David's son and then closing that off, it ended up being a door to go through and say, all right, in what way is Jesus both the Son of God and the Son of David in the Passion narrative?
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. So you give like this full length treatment then of all the Davidic material. This book's so great. If anybody is interested in, the ways in which a New Testament writer is creatively interacting with the Old Testament, you're going to love Dr. Johnson's book, because it's comprehensive. He goes through, and as he mentioned, he gives a lot of, insight from history of interpretation as well, which I appreciated a lot. So where do we start? The Passion narrative, we've got basically like the arrest, the trial, the crucifixion, the resurrection. So maybe let's start with the arrest. And here you point out something that I think others have seen, but you go further with it and drawing the connections for us. And this would be the connections between Jesus as a new David or Davidic Messiah, being arrested on the Mount of Olives, being betrayed by his closest companion. There's a lot of close connections, like beyond what somebody could say is just, oh, this is coincidental, like very, very intentionally drawn out connections between this event and what we could refer to as the Absalom Revolt, one of David's sons turning against him. So can you just take us through that? And maybe for those that don't have all the text right to mind, just give them a few hooks, places where Matthew is clearly drawing on this Absalom Revolt.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the Passion narrative in Matthew, after the Last Supper, Jesus goes out. He goes on the Mount of Olives, and before he goes, his men offer, he's basically saying, my soul is troubled to the point of death, and this prediction that they're going to desert him, and his disciples say they'll follow him unto death. Then it says he's emotionally distressed there. He prays, and of course, very famously, he is betrayed by his close associate, Judas. Then Judas arrives and he calls him friend, which is only in Matthew, Tyra. There's an ensuing kerfuffle here, and in that, one of the disciples cuts off and strikes another with a sword, cuts off his ear, which actually Matthew used the word earlobe there, which is very interesting, only gospel to use that. And then Jesus, of course, disapproves of the show of violence. He says that he has access to a heavenly army, but he does not call upon it. And then going into chapter 27 now, of course, Jesus' betrayer, Judas, goes out and hangs himself. When we turn to the Absalom Revolt, and this is now in 2 Samuel, starting in chapter 15, David goes out. He goes to the Mount of Olives. His men offer to follow with him even unto death. He's emotionally distressed. He prays while he's there. He's betrayed. His betrayer arrives, and he also calls his betrayer friend. This is Ahithophel in this narrative. There's an episode where there's a threat to strike one of the enemies. This is in this very famous scene of Shimei. But there's a threat to strike him on the head. Shall I cut off this dead dog's head? But David disapproves. And then he restrains his army, are his mighty men on his right and his left. And finally, David's betrayer goes out and hangs himself. And these are the only two characters in the Christian canon, in the Greek Bible, to hang themselves. And it's the exact same verbal form. The only two places that verbal form appears, hangsato. So something's going on here, obviously. The other really fascinating, to me at least, part of this is that all of those are sequential. So these are in order in Matthew, and they're also in the same exact order in 2 Samuel, in the Septuagint version. So clearly Matthew's up to something. I mean, there's no possible coincidence here. These things could not line up in this way. So then it really raises the question of why. Why is Matthew's narrative so closely modeled on the Absalom Revolt? And this is a question I was interested in exploring in the book because I don't really go into historical Jesus studies as much in the book. That's an area that certainly is open in this conversation. But you might have somebody like John Dominic Crossan who would say, this is an example of prophecy historicized, or again, like David Friedrich Strauss following this model, or somebody like Mark Goodacre, who would say this is history scripturalized. So no, this is actually historical, but it's written in this kind of historical mode. I don't get into that as much in the book. I'm more focused on literary critical aspects of this, how Matthew's constructing a certain argument, a certain Jesus for his audience. And here I think he has in mind the backdrop of other Davidic Messiah figures at the time. So these would be literary Davidic Messiahs who are, for the most part, militant figures. These would be figures who, like in 4th Ezra, would destroy their enemies with their incinerating fire breath, or in Psalm of Solomon 17, would use the sword in a sort of militant way against those who might attack Jerusalem. So this militant model was literary. It was also historical. We have a very interesting cast of historical figures who we think claim to be a messianic warrior in some way from 4 BCE all the way until Bar Kokhba in 132 to 135. So really interesting cast here. Again, they're drawing on Davidic motifs, but they're doing that for militant ends. And so I think Matthew has both of these in mind. And some of these figures, both historical and literary, would engage in, active rebellion and armed violence. Others would draw on the aid of heavenly protection and heavenly violence. And so say, at my command, the walls of, this is the case of the Egyptian prophet, who's also somewhat of a messianic figure. At my command, the walls of Jerusalem will fall down. There will be heavenly aid, and I'll be set up as king over the people. So there's these other messianic ideologies out there. And in Matthew's case, in the arrest scene, Jesus both denounces using the sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword, when one of Jesus' disciples uses the sword. And also appealing to violent heavenly aid. Do you not think I could call upon my Father in heaven, and he would send as many as 12 legions of angels? But it must happen this way in order for the scriptures to be fulfilled. So Matthew is trying to construct this, I think, to show that Jesus is the Davidic Messiah, but a different Davidic Messiah. He's not a militant warrior. He's not one that's calling upon violent heavenly aid, but he's presented as somebody who's true to his own philosophy in the Sermon on the Mount. He turns the other cheek. And so he's this non-militant Davidic Messiah.
Yeah. That's great. And so what is the twist there, I guess, in a sense, is non-militant Davidic Messiah, because others were drawing on Davidic tradition to bolster, some kind of popular claim to the throne or whatever, which would involve using violence. And Matthew is drawing on Davidic material to show Jesus is a non-violent Messiah. So it's like he's picking different parts of the Davidic tradition than others were. So he's doing the same thing in that he's drawing on the Davidic tradition, but the Davidic tradition is very diverse. There's a lot of different kind of Davids you can construct. And so he's constructing a non-violent Davidic Messiah here. Yeah. That's
which is hard to do.
Yeah. Right.
David narratives.
Right.
I like to joke that David literally kills the messenger twice.
Right.
We have 2 stories where he kills the messenger. And so David, I found in some ways I was starting to be drawn to the David narratives and the material we find there because David is such a complex character. And when David is on the throne, he tends to be very violent and impulsive, and he's out to protect himself at the cost of others. When he's off the throne, he is a suffering figure in a way that is very amenable to what Matthew's doing here. When he's being attacked by Saul, right? He has opportunities to kill Saul. He has the spear right by his head while Saul is sleeping in his camp, and he doesn't do it. When Saul is relieving himself in the cave, he has an opportunity to kill him. He doesn't take it. Same with the Absalom Revolt. He has opportunities to get back at his son, or he get opportunity to get back at Shimei, and he doesn't use those opportunities. So when David is off the throne, he's a penitent figure that Matthew can draw on for his nonviolent Messiah or his suffering Messiah. The David who's on the throne lends himself more towards these sort of warrior figures. And so there's so many possibilities with David. Matthew, drawing on Mark, is really the first to draw on this type of David figure for his formulation of the David Messiah.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Yeah, I feel like, broadly speaking, when it comes to narrating a life of Jesus, what we find in the traditions are the pre-enthronement David. Like, those are the traditions that the writers are drawing on, which kind of makes sense if they're thinking of enthronement as resurrection, heavenly enthronement,
Yeah.
then all that imagery from David that gets shifted to post-resurrection.
Yes.
And then it's like the suffering, lamenting stuff fits really well into the life of Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so yeah, that's really, I think, a helpful intro into what you're doing. The next chapter, I think it's the next chapter, maybe it's the one after that, where you get into Psalms. I think this is just so interesting, thinking about Psalms of David and how they're being read in this, what you can call like a late Second Temple context, the ancient Jewish interpretive culture that the gospel writers are swimming in. You've got David being read, or Psalms of David being read both as Davidic autobiography, and we can actually trace the development of that because you can see in the tradition as it gets added to over time, right? So this is happening all the way up into and even past the life of Jesus, this kind of thing. Davidic autobiography and messianic prophecy. Yeah, like these two things are kind of happening together. So can you just give us some examples of how this works, and what is Matthew doing in this context? Like, how is he handling Psalms of David or whatever we call it?
Yeah. So in a way, what I was confronting going into the portion on the Psalms was, okay, we've dealt with the arrest. Now we're moving towards Jesus' trials and finally the crucifixion. And we don't have any references, well, not many references to something like the Absalom Revolt, something like the narrative material that's found in Samuel. What we do have are lots and lots of references to the Psalms, and specifically the Psalms of individual lament. In past scholarship, often these are generalized. So people talk about the psalmist,
or the righteous sufferer in the Psalms,
righteous sufferer, the innocent sufferer who's writing this. And I think in a way that's taking its cue from form criticism and Hermann Gunkel. And I think that is very fair to what's going on in Hebrew Bible studies. When we get to the New Testament, though, we have to see how these Psalms have been interpreted. We're not looking at their background, their Zitz and Laban anymore. We have to see how they're interpreted as they get to Matthew. And so I wanted to trace out, do we see in Judaism at this time readings of the Psalms that focus on a general figure like the psalmist or the righteous sufferer? Righteous sufferer is a scholarly term, and so, of course, we don't really see that. But even psalmist is a neologism from the 4th century. And so this is the 4th century CE or 80.
Right.
So this comes 300 years after Matthew that the term psalmist appears for the first time. So it's entirely anachronistic to use that to interpret Matthew. So then the question is, how do people read the Psalms when it's talking about suffering and individual lament and plot elements in the Psalms? Who do they imagine that to be? And I didn't want to make a universal case that everyone read this in a certain way. Of course, there's enormous diversity. However, over time, you can start to plot an increased, what I call Davidization of the Psalms. So as it starts to form as a book, as superscripts are added on, these are the titles above the Psalm, toward the end. We think these might be musical notations or something like that.
I want to get into that too. The Aesotelos difference between that and limited Zehach. Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah, good.
So we get more and more Davidic attributions added on here. And the question is, are these saying David wrote this psalm? Or just David spoke this psalm, or it refers to that? I am uncertain on that question, actually. But the thing that was important for me is they refer to David in some way. And then over time, people actually start to coordinate these events in the Psalter with events in the life of David. And so there's this back and forth conversation between Samuel and also these Davidic superscripts on the Psalms, where they'll add in elements of this was written when David was persecuted by his son Absalom. That's very early in the Psalter, or when he was persecuted by Saul and was fleeing from him. So there's this conversation that's going on there. And then once you get into the Syriac Psalter, some of the additional psalms that are added on, we get all the way up to Psalm 155 here, if our reckoning is accurate. Those are Davidic psalms for the most part. And they continue this autobiographical function. These are psalms of David when he fought the bear and the lion, when he faced this trial or that trial. So over time, we see that David becomes more and more of a dominant figure, up to the point where some of these psalms, they really erase the references to the sons of Korah or other figures like that, and they'll just write David in there. Or it'll be an event that happens after the lifetime of David, like the dedication of the temple.
Right.
Clearly happens after David.
Can't be about David. Yeah, right.
But you get into some of these Greek manuscripts, and they add in, this is of David. So there's this increasing process. I think Matthew is right in the middle of that process where, yes, there's a flow towards increased Davidization, but it hasn't gotten to the point that you get in the 4th century where people are claiming that David wrote all 150 Psalms. That is a further point on this sort of trajectory that I see moving through. Again, admitting that there's also a great diversity in that. And so I think Matthew, if he has these Psalms show up in his crucifixion narrative or in the trial scenes, we should set that within the Jewish context of the time, which is to say, these are often, mostly, read as references to the life of David. And so they're autobiographical in that way. He wrote them or he sang them, or they're in reference to events in his life. Mm-hmm. So now that's going to help Matthew make his argument, which we'll get into in a moment. But I think there's a question about superscripts here as well.
Oh, well, yeah. Maybe you could just explain that. I found this so fascinating when I first came across it. And of course, you can find debate among Septuagint scholars in terms of like what the translators were trying to communicate and all that. Yeah. But at the level of what then a reader is going to read when they're reading the Greek text with no reference to the Hebrew,
yes,
we have this, as you said, ambiguous reference to some musical note in Greek that's superscripted. And then that gets translated into Greek as aistatelos, which literally means unto the end.
Yeah.
Or the what is the telos, the completed goal, the end or whatever. Yeah. And what we can find that. So yeah, that's what's there. Now tell us why that might be important for how some early Jesus followers could be reading these Psalms.
Yeah, and you asked me to tell us how this might be important.
That's
I think
right.
There's a pun there, perhaps. Tell us. Yeah, certainly. So the aistatelos superscript is, for the most part, the translation of lamnatzeach in Hebrew, for the leader, something like that. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, this does get picked up in rabbinic literature, eschatologically at times as well, to refer to eschatological psalms. In other words, these psalms also pertain to the end. I don't know if that's a conversation between Greek and Hebrew in the rabbinic period, and so we can't apply it to the Second Temple period.
Like maybe they're kind of reflecting back on what people have been saying about the Septuagint and stuff like that. Yeah.
But it is fascinating to see that there's some possibilities out there, even within Hebrew, for this title. But certainly when it gets into Greek, and we have aistatelos, for the end, unto the end, something along those lines, it does set up a kind of eschatological cue for readers who are predisposed to that. So if they're apocalyptically minded, eschatologically minded, they can pick up on that cue. And a number of the Psalms that are going to show up in Matthew's Passion narrative are these aistatelos Psalms that also have a Davidic superscript or attribution to them. So they're to Dawid or to Dawid, for David, of David, something along those lines, or by David even possibly. And so, this combination of those two elements is suggesting like these Psalms could be read eschatologically and Davidically, which is precisely how Matthew is reading them. It appears in his Passion narrative.
Yeah. And as you show in the book, right, it makes good sense of what Matthew's doing. And we do have explicit references in early Christian interpreters commenting on this superscription, which again, it doesn't say for sure this is how a gospel writer was doing it, but it's additional evidence to say, yeah, this is something a Greek reader would see and probably is picking up on to some extent. So
Yeah,
it's good.
absolutely.
Okay, so obviously there's a lot of Psalms. I mean, you have a nice chart in your book of all of these Psalms that are being used. I guess we could just go here. The big one, right, is Psalm 22, which is just like shot throughout the crucifixion scene.
Yeah.
But what you argue, and I think this is absolutely correct, I mean, to my mind, that it's not just a crucifixion psalm, it's also a resurrection psalm.
Yeah.
And those who have read the Epistle to the Hebrews, chapter 2, will know, in fact, this gets picked up as a resurrection text in Hebrews. But the question is, where is it in the Gospels, if at all? Is it in the tradition? So could you just kind of walk us through how Psalm 22 is both a crucifixion and resurrection psalm? Maybe just give us some key examples that you see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I might be dodging the question just for a moment too. But just to set that up, of Psalm 22 is so well known here, and I think it's important that we do explore, is it in reference to the resurrection and not just the crucifixion? It may be helpful by way of setup to look at some of these other Psalms that get used as well,
sure.
that are maybe not as commonly seen, and then we can see how, because the Psalm 22 material,
everybody kind of knows that that's there to some extent.
So even before we get there, in the trial before Pilate, for example, Jesus is, as it says, he's not. Pilate asks, is he not hearing what Pilate's saying to Jesus here? And then it says that Jesus has no reply. He's later flogged then. And, Pilate very famously washes his hands. All of these elements come from the Psalms. They come from Psalms of individual lament. And they're Davidic Psalms, particularly Psalm 38. So in some ways, we recognize Psalm 22 as this passion psalm par excellence. But there's also these other Psalms that are sprinkled through there, and they're not always just isolated references, one or two words, but they're really embedded throughout, as Psalm 38 is in this case. So we get these references that help explain, why isn't Jesus responding, or why is he just going to his death without really putting up an argument when he's before Pilate? Pilate's so in a way miffed at Jesus, the taciturn Jesus that's before him, the Jesus that won't talk, that won't respond. And again, these are coming from these Psalms of suffering David figure who doesn't respond when accused, because God is the one who's going to ultimately secure his fate one way or another. And so I think this helps early Jesus followers make sense of Jesus' death. Why didn't he at least put up an argument or something like that? Well, it's connected to this quiet, suffering Davidic figure from the Psalter, who entrusts themselves fully to God without even giving a reply on their own. And so, Matthew's doing some interesting things, I think, there, drawing on these trials. But then when we get over to Psalm 22, this is, yes, of course, the famous Passion Psalm. And so in some ways, it's less exploring these connections and more, what do we make of them? And again, with that backdrop in mind of the Davidization of the Psalter, it starts to click that, why would Matthew do this? Well, he's connecting these to a Psalm of David, in which David is supposed to have suffered. So there, I think many will be familiar with casting lots to divide Jesus' garments. That's obviously from Psalm 22. Even some of the lines that are delivered against Jesus, so when people are going by and they're shaking their heads, that's directly from the Psalm. This line where people are hurling insults at him and reviling him, also from the Psalm. They say, he trusted in God, let him rescue him if he wants him. That's directly from the Psalm. So even some of the characters in the Passion narrative are using the words of Psalm 22 and throwing them back at Jesus in a way that is found exactly in the Psalm. So those are mostly found in Matthew's adding on to and amplifying what's in Mark. Of course, we also have Psalm 69, which is this drinking of the wine mixed with gall and the vinegar, which really forms an inclusio or bookends around the crucifixion scene itself. And so that's another individual psalm of lament and Davidic as well. But Matthew goes further than Mark in bringing this psalm into the resurrection scene. So there's a very famous debate ongoing in Markan scholarship of when Jesus refers to the first line, my God, why have you forsaken me? The Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani.
Is he referring to the whole
to
psalm?
the entire psalm, or is he just referring to the lament portion of the psalm? And the difference is the lament is about 2/3 of the psalm, but then there's a thanksgiving at the end where David, the suffering figure, is delivered from this and gives thanks to God, and does so in a way that goes to other generations. And so when Jesus references that line, is he referring to the entire psalm or just the lament portion? In Matthew, we don't have to have the same debate, is what I'm trying to show, because Matthew, at least, whatever, Max, you Markan scholars, I'm sorry. I don't have any help for you there. But at least in Matthew, it is clear because Matthew does draw on elements that go into the Thanksgiving portion of the psalm. So the resurrection happens at dawn. And this actually takes a little bit of arguing because that verse is notoriously difficult to translate. Matthew 28:1, when exactly does this happen? But it does happen sometime around dawn. And the superscript, again, this title of the psalm in Greek is concerning the aid at dawn, basically concerning the help that happens at dawn for this Davidic figure unto the end as well. And so Matthew's able to draw on that in a way that, this is happening at dawn. And indeed, this psalm talks about the aid that's going to happen at dawn, at least from Matthew's perspective. The really clear example of this, though, is when Jesus commands Mary Magdalene and the other women to go and say to my brothers, tois adelphois mu, go to the brothers, tell them about this, that this has happened. And those 3 words are found exactly in Psalm 22, and they're not found in any of the other Gospels. This is something that Matthew has very intentionally added in, that this message goes to my brothers in a way that references the Thanksgiving portion of the psalm, because this is going to be a Thanksgiving, a celebration that's going to be brought to this person's brothers. So at least in the case of Matthew, he's drawing on other elements of this. I also think that the fear of the centurion, in Matthew's gospel, we have the centurion who's afraid after all of these
portents and all this kind of stuff.
That happen. The earthquake and the saints coming out. He's afraid, and that might draw on some of this language of fear, those who fear the Lord in Psalm 22 as well. So interesting possibilities there, but the to my brothers is really a clear example of drawing on the Thanksgiving portion of Psalm 22.
Yeah, that's great. So he's basically, would you say, tell me if you think this is fair, Matthew is seeing what Mark is doing, and he's clearly tracking what Mark is doing with his scriptures. And he's reading Mark, he's reading his scriptures, and he's like adding more to that, along with to kind of draw out even further what's already there in the tradition.
Yes. So I do have to tip my hat to Mark, as
you got to give this guy some credit. He was so neglected for so much of church history.
There's all these arguments, of course, about the relationship between Matthew and Mark. Is Matthew kind of saving for orthodoxy what Mark created? That's Mark Goodacre has a recent piece on that. It's very interesting. Matthew Larson has a really interesting piece on Mark is more or less a rough draft that Matthew then cleans up. And again, Matthew is the more popular gospel, certainly in the history of interpretation, up until people became interested in the historical Jesus and going back to our earliest gospel. But yes, Mark has certainly left a mark here, no pun intended, on this text with these references to the Hebrew Bible. And Matthew has really expanded on that. So I would say about 40% of the material that I was finding in the book was Zondergut, was material that's only going to be found in Matthew. And I would italicize that in my charts to show just how much material Matthew's adding on. But he's drawing on Mark, I think, with a very similar purpose of showing Jesus is the Davidic Messiah. And how could he be the Davidic Messiah if he suffered and died and he wasn't a conquering warrior? Well, David suffered in these ways. David didn't die in these ways, but he suffered in these ways. And so Matthew's able to coordinate those. But he's drawing on Mark. He's expanding what Mark does. So there are other examples of Matthew really adding on Davidic material, even outside the Passion narrative. So when Jesus goes into the temple after he enters in triumphal, he heals the blind and the lame there. Mm-hmm. And that phrase, the blind and the lame, is a direct reference to 2 Samuel 5, right. A very strange episode where this is where David is conquering what's going to become Jerusalem, and the Jebusites put out the blind and the lame on the wall as a sort of taunt. Mm-hmm. Obviously, very cruel, very insensitive taunt. And there's this strange line in there that it says, therefore, to this day, David hates the blind and the lame. And then it gives an etiology: the blind and the lame shall not enter into the house of the Lord. And so here we have Jesus as Davidic Messiah going into the house of the Lord, where the blind and the lame are not supposed to be in the David tradition, and he's healing them in that space. And so it's both drawing on the tradition and also subverting it, is creating a kind of new Davidic connection. And that's an example that's only in Matthew, but again, he's building on what Mark does. Mark has I think a very clear reference to Zechariah 9 in the entrance into Jerusalem. Jesus is riding on this beast of burden here, but Matthew makes it very obvious with a fulfillment quotation. This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet: "Tell daughter Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt full of donkey." And maybe Jesus is riding both.
What's up with Matthew? Does he not understand Hebrew parallelism, or what the heck is going on there?
Yeah, Tucker Ferda has a really good argument about that recently in an article. Say, no, that's not the case. He understands Hebrew parallelism better than we do. This reference here, but at the very least, right, it's very clear he's trying to connect this to the Hebrew Bible, and he's doing so in a way that's sometimes drawing on and expanding and making more explicit what Mark was already doing.
Yeah, for sure. This is so random. Have you ever seen that Jean-Claude Van Damme commercial where he's like doing the splits on two cars as they like space out or whatever? It's got Enya music playing in the background. It's so great. Well, anyway, when I taught this in this passage from Matthew in class, I said, just in case you guys are wondering if it's actually possible to ride two donkeys at the same time, and then I put the Jean-Claude Van Damme video on for them to just visualize it, because he's full spread eagle. He's got both legs on both vehicles, so it's possible. Just in case anybody's wondering.
Yeah, go to a rodeo.
Can ride two animals at once.
Yeah, for some of the intermission entertainment, you'll probably see somebody riding two horses at the same time.
My gosh! My gosh! Oh man, I want to ask you. So you had brought up the saints rising when Jesus is crucified. Yeah. That's obviously unique to Matthew.
Yeah.
That for me, that is one of the weirdest statements in the entire New Testament that I don't know if anybody fully knows what to do with. I mean, at a literary level, maybe, but what do you make of that? So he's on the cross. There's this earthquake, and other people rise from the dead while he's crucified. So for Matthew, Jesus isn't even the first one that rises from the dead in some ways. And then what happens to them? People saw them, and then what? They left, or whatever.
The strangest thing is that they appear in the holy city after Jesus' resurrection, so they must just be hanging out for a few days. One scholar jokes, "What did they do? Maybe they just had a cigarette, or they're sitting at the entrance of their tombs here for 2 days, 3 days, possibly." until they appear in the holy city. So what was going on there? Yeah, I mean, I think within Matthew's context, this is very clearly presaging the beginning of the end of the age. If you have not just an individual resurrection, but the start of the general resurrection. Here we think of Paul, Jesus as the first fruits of the resurrection as well. So that's at least going on there. There's also these traditions that coordinate Ezekiel 37, the Valley of Dry Bones, and Zechariah 14, which said all this was going to happen on the Mount of Olives. That's why you have all these tombs today on the Mount of Olives. And so the belief at this time, we can see from Dura Europas and some of the frescoes there that the bones of these saints would actually, even if they were elsewhere, they'd rattle through these tunnels underground and they'd pop up on the Mount of Olives. That's where the resurrection, bodily resurrection, is going to happen. Is Matthew doing exactly that? No, but we do have these traditions around the Mount of Olives that I think are significant. And the idea that Jesus' death, and not just his resurrection, is the beginning of the end of the age. There's darkness at noon. We just had a total solar eclipse here, so I had to go through with my students and explain why Jesus did not die during a total solar eclipse, the difference between a new moon and a full moon and all of that. That would occur during Passover. But we have darkness at noon. That is definitely a sign for the end in Matthew milieu, drawing on the prophet. All these things that are supposed to take place at the end. And we can see that actually in Matthew 24, Matthew's little apocalypse here, that many of the things that are supposed to happen, there's like they're going to be brought before the authorities, they're going to be purged, they'll have to appear before the authorities. Now, all these things happen to Jesus, that he says are going to happen at the end. So the end of the ages has begun.
It's happened. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it begun, or has it been, in a way, perhaps even not completed, but filled out in Jesus' death? I'm not exactly sure how Matthew would have thought about that if we were to ask him. But something here is going on that very clearly ties not just the resurrection of Jesus, but the death of Jesus to the end of the ages.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. All right, I want to ask you then a little bit about Matthew and Judaism. There's a whole, conversation in scholarship now about the within Judaism. Basically, just take a book of the New Testament and then put within Judaism after it, ? Or whatever. But I mean, this is important for Matthew, I think, because obviously this is a gospel that goes way back in the tradition where it's said, this is for either towards, against, engaging with in some way other Jews who are non-Jesus believing Jews. So based on kind of just all your research and looking at messianism, which definitely intersects with this conversation, what's your kind of thinking on that now?
Yeah, I went into this wondering how I would frame Matthew's relationship to Judaism, since I see Matthew as a Jewish author through and through. And at the same time, I'm arguing that Matthew's doing something different and in some ways something novel, drawing on Mark. And so to make a case for a Davidic Messiah who suffers rather than a Davidic Messiah who conquers, a Davidic Messiah who is killed by the Romans rather than who kills the Romans, is something that would, on the one hand, be surprising in his day. On the other hand, he's doing it in a way that is entirely comfortable within first century Judaism. He's using scripture. He's using references to scripture to show that his Messiah is the Messiah and is a Davidic Messiah. That's how you do it. So it's trying to have this tightrope walk and keep the balance between Matthew's doing something new and different and Matthew's doing that in a familiar way. That was something that really gripped me as I was going into the conclusion. How do I explain this? How do I narrate this? And so, again, I think Matthew is drawing upon his own tradition to describe a Jewish Messiah who he believes is the Messiah. And then he was unaware of the history that would happen after him about, maybe a parting of the ways, however we want to narrate that, or the ways that never part. But at least they certainly disagree with each other, and at times, especially on the Christian side, Christian anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, violence against Jewish people is a very, very real part of history, but also one that can be tied to Matthew. His blood be upon us and upon our children. So Matthew is a really key text in this discussion, kind of interfaith discussion and the scholarly discussion. For me, it was placing Matthew very firmly within Judaism and saying he's reading scripture as you would do. He's drawing on the same kind of hermeneutical principles, perhaps too strong a word, but sensibilities, as any person writing Messiah text would. And he's also, and this is drawing on Matthew Novenson, he's using scripture and its idealizations to make sense of his empirical circumstances.
Right.
He believes in a Messiah who's been crucified. And so how does he make sense of that? He wrestles with scriptures. He sees through the scriptures as a first century Jewish writer. So again, it's this tension between novelty and tradition that I think we always find in hermeneutics. There always has to be this kind of wrestling with the tradition, but also in light of circumstances that are new and different. And so in Matthew's case, it is this crucified Messiah that represents the new kind of
it's the big thing that needs to be explained, or the thing that you're reading it through. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I personally place Matthew very firmly within Judaism. I see, the more I read rabbinic literature, and I spent a lot of time, this comes out more in the footnotes of the book than it does in the main text. Occasionally I'm interacting with rabbinic authors. For instance, this tradition that the one who's taken my bread will rise up against me. That's found in the Psalms. Psalm 55, this is actually a reference more in Mark than it is in Matthew. And my close associate has betrayed me. That's in Psalm 42. Those two elements are taken to refer to Ahithophel in later rabbinic literature. So in Psalm 42 and Psalm 55, later rabbinic literature, in the Babylonian Talmud and in the Midrash on the Psalms, both of those take that to refer to Ahithophel, which is exactly what I'm saying Matthew's doing, is drawing on this Ahithophel tradition and then taking it and sort of reformulating it with Judas and Jesus. So drawing on that literature is really helpful, even though it postdates the New Testament. At the same time, right, there's this question of this is applying to Jesus, and so it has this kind of historical specificity to it, rather than simply a reading of the text.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Another thing you said in your concluding chapter, which I thought was really, really wise, was just because you have to kind of walk a tightrope here. It is novel to see, obviously, a crucified Messiah. Like, that's just a novelty that comes. I mean, there's a reason why Paul said this is a stumbling block and a scandal. Like, it's just it's to everybody. This crucified Messiah piece is just completely, to call it a curveball is like an understatement. It's just it's earth-shattering new reality. So that obviously is going to inform the messianism that Matthew's up to. But you do point out as well that it's not correct to just set up, Christianity as this pacifistic messianic movement versus a militant Judaism. That Judaism itself knows of pacifism and has messianic ideologies that are not of the kind of militant sort. So we have to be careful in terms of, I think you did a nice job stating that at the end, and I think it's important to kind of point out that a lot of this language about Judaism that's in New Testament studies has been really self-serving. It's been Christians commenting on Judaism in a self-serving way, and it doesn't really have any place in history. And it kind of says something. I think it actually reflects pretty poorly on Christianity as well. Like, the only way to make Jesus look good is to make other Jews look bad. That's a pretty weak Jesus. So
there's an insecurity there, I think, that comes out when scholars try to do that. And of course, if Matthew is Jewish, then this is an example of a Jewish Messiah figure who is peaceful, right? And so we don't have these terms that can bifurcate of Christianity and Judaism at this time. And so here's our example. Here is a nonviolent Davidic Jewish Messiah in the first century. Those terms have taken on different valences and different meanings over time. But if we're reading with Matthew, if we're reading in Matthew's context, that's what he's seeing as an example of a Jewish Messiah figure. And I think the circumstances around this are difficult because we have to look at Roman imperial violence as well.
Mm-hmm.
And these aren't just bad guys who are going around claiming to be Davidic messiahs. They're trying to confront Roman imperial violence through violent means. That was one of the options. Colluding was an option. But normally the elites were the only ones who could really collude with Rome. And so they had difficult circumstances. The Jesus tradition shows a different possibility, one that ends in very much the same way, execution of its leader, but does model a kind of different response to Rome, again, within Judaism. And then we have these other nonviolent protest movements within Judaism at the time, which aren't messianic. Sometimes they're prophetic, but at least they do model how this was an option. Nonviolence was an option within the Judaism of the time.
Yeah, no, that's good. So what's next for you? Where are you going now with scholarship? Are you getting in more into historical Jesus stuff, or what are you up to?
So that's a growing area for me that I'm curious about, and that's in some ways responding to my own teaching context right now. But I'm fascinated by these other Messiah figures and other prophet figures. And so the next project, I've been doing more and more conference presentations and amassing chapters on Jesus and the other Messiahs, the other prophets. I think they need a fresh look. We rely on Richard Horsley, who did fantastic work in the 80s, but there's a lot of different ways of reading, different sociological models that we have that can help give us some further traction on these figures who ultimately left behind just little paragraphs in Josephus, and that's about it. And so we have to use a little bit more historical imagination. We're embarrassed with riches when it comes to the Jesus tradition. And so we have so much material here to work with. Now I'm looking at other Messiah movements, and
you've got one source and one paragraph and one source, exactly, and you're like, okay, well, this guy was he was a shepherd and young shepherd with his brothers. That sounds kind of like David. Yeah,
exactly. That's about all we have to go on. So we have to use more imagination there.
Yeah.
But as a historian, that's something that you ultimately have to appeal to when your sources are limited. So I'm really fascinated by these figures, and again, how are the gospel writers actually negotiating the failures of these other movements and the Jewish-Roman war that culminated in 70 with the destruction of the temple, but actually went to 73. How do they show, yes, Jesus is the Messiah, but he's not one of those Messiahs? They have to walk a tightrope as well. And I think they do it very well, to the point that we don't even remember these figures. But when Matthew and Mark talk about false messiahs and false prophets will appear, and they'll lead people astray, and they'll gather in the wilderness, and they'll say, I am he. They have these figures in mind, I think. And so they're trying to narrate this in a way that, yes, Jesus is a Messiah. Yes, he was crucified and executed as a kingly figure, but he's not one of those kingly figures who's really trying to form an insurrection. So that's the project right now. And
that's great. Really and what would be the rhetorical purposes of making that point, other than Jesus told us this stuff was going to come and happen? Is it I guess I'm thinking back into the 80s, the height of 70s, really the height of redaction criticism, where it was this is an argument against the Peter party. There was a group within Jewish followers of Jesus who wanted to join their brothers and sisters in war, and so Mark had to write this against that group to dissuade them. No, don't go that way. My sense is that's probably not what you're suggesting. But I'm just curious, what do you think the purchase of that kind of argument would be.
Yeah. For Mark and Matthew, I think it's slightly different. Again, this gets into the dating of those, but I think that's a valid possibility for Mark, that he was trying to show that this is a ruinous option. Don't go that way. Matthew very clearly knows, and Luke even more so, that this ends in destruction. And we see other reflections on this, right? In Fourth Ezra, Second Baruch, other Jewish authors are reflecting on where this road leads as well in hindsight. And so this distancing to say, yeah, Jesus isn't like one of those, and therefore you don't have to watch his followers too closely. Jesus' family actually gets taken up before one of the emperors and questioned because of their connections to the line of David. And so there's a question: are they forming their own dynasty? Are they trying to make
Can you hear me?
Kind of kingdom here?
I think I might have lost
Those
you.
are really live questions after the time of Jesus, and of course Jesus' brother is executed as well. So it's that distancing, but also trying to keep them out of harm's way that I think is important.
Hey, sorry, we lost you there for a second.
Yeah,
Can you hear me okay?
I think that was on my end. I apologize. So
no worries. Yeah, so I mean, we're wrapping up anyway. But you and I can edit it too, so it's not a big deal.
I'm sorry.
No problem at all. But yeah, you were talking about, I think maybe just want to say a little bit about Matthew. We can wrap it up there. Like just what you were saying about Matthew and looking back retrospectively on the war. And,
okay.
Yeah,
kind of point there. I can start there.
Yeah.
So in the case of Mark, I think there's a live possibility that he's trying to argue, don't follow these other figures into war. Matthew and Luke, they have more of a perspective and retrospective, really, of what happens if you go this route and embrace militant messianism. They're also trying to, I think, keep their followers safe. So we have the instance of an emperor who's calling upon Jesus' family because of their connections to the line of David, and they question Jesus' family. Is he trying to form another kingdom? This is a tradition that's given in Eusebius drawing on Hegesippus. And so we do get indications that there was concern about a Messiah figure, a kingly figure, and setting up a dynasty. So I think they're not unaware of those possibilities at this time. And obviously, Jesus' brother was executed as well. So that's another factor to this. But ultimately, it does help them distance Jesus from these other Messiah figures and movements in a very dangerous time.
Yeah. Could there be a little bit of like an apologetic slant, like maybe we see in Acts of this is not the kind of movement we are, sort of thing?
I think so. Yeah. I think when we get to Matthew, there is a sense of posturing, yes, towards a Jewish audience, but also a sense that Gentiles are going to be reading this as well. By the end of Matthew, going to all the nations with this message. So that is a factor, and hugely in Luke. So Rome is suddenly not just the background, but also a foreground and an audience that's possible for this.
Good. All right. Well done. I think I've exhausted you. So thank you so much for indulging many more questions than we'd even planned on discussing. So, hey, everybody, the book is right here. It's fantastic. Suffering Son of David in Matthew's Passion Narrative. It's an award-winning book. Is it out in paperback yet? Or is that you got to wait 2 years, right? With Cambridge,
here.
So hey, it's worth it. I'd still say go out and shill out the big bucks for the Cambridge book, but if not, get your library to get it, and then keep your eyes on when the paperback comes out as well, because they become more affordable in, I think it's another year. So
that's right.
Thanks, Nathan. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Max.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure that you are subscribed to our channel for more content. And if you're interested in supporting us, the best way you can do so is by becoming a member of the Center for Bible Study. Link in the description. Thanks.